All right. Well, I'd like to say hello myself. I'm Bridget Hamilton. I'm an associate professor and the director of the Centre for Mental Health Nursing. And also I'm the co-chair of the Mental Health and Society program inside the Melbourne Social Equity Institute. And on behalf of our program, I'd like to welcome everyone today to this special seminar in a series as part of a 2021 Mental Health and Society seminar series. I'd like to start by acknowledging the elders, both past and present and emerging, of the Wurundjeri people who are the custodians of the land that I'm sitting in today and enjoying the sunshine and the gum trees out my window. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that you are on as well, everyone who's participating, and Helen in particular, and also the lands where the university campuses are situated. These lands and waterways are places of age-old ceremony, celebration, initiation and renewal, and the local Aboriginal people have had and continue to have a unique role in the life of these lands. And I know we're all very grateful for that, the spaces where we are. Just before we launch into our seminar session today, I just want to flag a few housekeeping points. So this session is being recorded, it's commenced recording, and it's going to be available via the Institute's website after the event. So if you can't stay for the whole thing or you'd like to pass it on to friends and colleagues, that will be possible. Usually takes a couple of days for that loading to happen. We can perhaps notify you about that. Today we are going to be using the Q&A function, so please do liberally post any questions that you have for Helen in that box. We've also got the chat function turned on today, and if people want to just say hello and to chat amongst yourselves, I think it's particularly a nice opportunity to touch base with one another, especially since most of us, at least in Victoria, are back to working from home within the current restrictions. So feel free to use the chat for that purpose, but the Q&A function for your questions for Helen. And without any further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today. So Professor Helen Cahill works in the Graduate School of Education at the University of Melbourne. She leads a body of research addressing youth wellbeing. She specialises in the use of participatory methods to foster the contribution of youth voice, and she's given us the heads up that we'll be hearing some young people today. She's a leading innovator of Australian wellbeing interventions addressing prevention of gender-based violence and promotion of social and emotional learning. And I know I'm excited to be hearing from Helen about the school-based social and emotional learning programs used to advance wellbeing post-emergency. So I'll just hand over to you now, Helen, and thank you so much for today.
Thanks very much, Bridget, and thanks everyone who's attending today. It's an honour to have the opportunity to address you. And I'd also like to add my respects to those of Bridget's, just for all of us wherever we're gathering, to acknowledge our Indigenous owners of our various lands and to pay respect and gratitude for their contribution continuing and from past through to present and future. So what I've prepared for you today is a little bit of a combination of some of the data that shows the need for schools to provide additional support for student mental health in these times, a little bit of research which shows the kinds of interventions that are useful, and I'm privileging a little bit of a flavour also of what a social emotional learning program might be like if we had one in action, and bringing to you a little bit of student voice around that. And I hope that that will work to serve your interests today. So I do have a presentation for you, and this will be available if people need a copy of it as well. So really, one of the things that is very evident for us when we're thinking about school-based social emotional learning programs is the need for timely responses to what's going on in the current situation with the emergencies created through the pandemic. And that brings us to my key assertion for today, that now is the time more than ever to focus on building social and emotional learning into the core of the school program. And the key reason being that, as we know, students are experiencing really heightened levels of mental and social health problems. And they're very much more exposed to levels of stress in the family. So if we focus the school response, what we can do is use these programs to improve mental health and also to help the kids settle into their learning in more productive ways. So as I think most people would be very aware, in the conditions in the community get more challenging for children in these times. So family violence typically increases during all different types of emergencies, including this one, and mental health problems increase not only during, but particularly post-emergency. And we have an equity lens on that reminds us that it's those who are most vulnerable before the emergency who are usually worst affected by it. So inequalities escalate during and post-emergency, particularly those suffering mental health and social health problems, those under financial stress, and those whose carers and parents find it hard to cope. But the other thing we are aware of from the emergencies research is that children and young people tend to experience the worst effect of emergencies in the aftermath rather than during. And they're usually affected mostly by what happens to their families. So when we look into the research that's been done around the world into emergency impacts more generally, we do really see that equity effect, the effect of inequity, and the kinds of things that lead to ongoing distress and challenges for children. What we should be mindful of, though, is our pre-existing inequalities. So there's a little bit of data I'm sharing with you here, Australian data around the intersection between socioeconomic disadvantage and the prevalence of mental health distress. So if we look at this data, we can see that 30% of children in Australia living with sole carer families dealing with unemployment have much more affected, of course, than their less impacted students, fellow students that they sit in class with. So if we have this lens on understanding mental health, we would be thinking that some schools serving more disadvantaged populations might need to have an even more escalated effort to contribute. There's a little bit of debate as to whether there are sufficient indicators that mental health is affected in the community. But I think if we look at these indicators, like when are people calling for help? We know that people don't call for help readily. Culturally, we're a very independent kind of nation. We like to cope with things on our own. And by the time we pick up a helpline and call for help, life's gotten pretty tough. But you can see from this data around the increase in calls to Lifeline, Beyond Blue, and this has been true for other help agencies, that we've had a really pronounced need for support going into families. This data there from the Taking the Pulse of the Nation series also shows us the kind of increase in distress that children might be living within their families, because this shows us like what's happening for adults in the pandemic. And what we can see from this data is that men in particular, people who are parenting, have far increased rates of stress. So they're worried about their children, they're worried about uncertain financial futures. And so what we're going to have in families is a less happy family background for kids to be learning at home in or leaving home to go to school. We also have some interesting data that was collected in Australia during the shutdown period last year. And this data was using parent inputs on what was happening to their children during shutdown. And the problems they're describing are those that I think teachers are very well acquainted with, around restlessness, inattentiveness, in particular problems with managing behaviour and the increased prevalence of conduct problems, kids losing their temper, getting out of control in managing their own emotions. So with that background in mind around what's been happening around mental health comes our agreement that there is going to be likely impact in the schools, and therefore we need to think about what's going to help. So when we turn to other research that's been done, say in the Australian context around what happens in other types of emergencies, such as following the bushfires that have affected large pieces of our population, we see that there's a pronounced effect for children when they get into the school. So difficulties around concentrating, difficulties around maintaining focus in learning in more cognitive areas, such that even some of our longitudinal research has showed that these impacts of these emergencies has a long-lasting effect on learning as well as on wellbeing. And so that clearly makes this the business of the school as well. Now, we might be thinking that the pandemic situation is new, and indeed it is new in many ways. But if we're looking for an evidence base, we can turn to two pre-existing fields that are quite robust. And one is the longer tradition of research into social and emotional learning. which is a huge portfolio of research with immense amount of evidence base, and a somewhat smaller but nonetheless consistent and robust type of research into disasters more generally, including disasters caused by natural disasters, but also conflict, when people are living in conflict affected zones. And when we turn to that literature, we see that schools, yes, of course, have a very well demonstrated record of providing multiple different kinds of support post-emergency, all of which make a positive contribution. But the one I'm talking about today is the provision of social and emotional learning programs. And the reason for that is because there's a strong evidence that this is maybe the most effective way to support longer term recovery and indeed contribute to prevention. So when we look into some of this research, we see that when schools do provide a robust social emotional learning program, not just in the few weeks in the aftermath, but in a more sustained way, like across a number of school terms, we do get better learning outcomes, we get reduction in mental health problems such as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and we get an increased capacity to use positive social support and positive coping strategies that we need not only for managing the impact of the emergency, but also just the changed circumstances of life in general. So some little examples for you to think about and learn from, I think. One is the notion sometimes that comes with emergencies that we need these specialised people to come in and do therapy with the children. But actually we have some studies that have shown that providing a universal program like for the whole class in social emotional learning is more effective in promoting mental health for the group than one-on-one targeted or specialised interventions. And we can certainly see that when these programs are provided, such as, for example, in this study I have up here conducted in the conflict affected zone in Israel, that students who had been withdrawn from school due to conflict, the streets were dangerous, they couldn't go out, they couldn't have the same level of social support, and then after a time they went back into their schools. Those who had the social emotional learning programs provided were far less likely to develop post-traumatic stress disorder than students in the control schools. So I've used conflict as the disaster or emergency that's most parallel to the pandemic, because as you can hear, there's some similar patterns of response, particularly in the breakdown in community life and the withholding of children from school. Similar data has been found in other research programs conducted in the Israeli context. This one in particular was interesting because it was secondary students. And again, they got a substantial social emotional learning program, 12-session program. But what we saw in the control schools is that while students in the intervention schools got better, those who went back to school got worse over time in terms of their mental health. So what that allowed us to see is that going back to school in itself is also a challenge after a period away. And we need to think about the fact that life can get more difficult back at school than it was at home, and how do we deal with that? A similar study was conducted, but with added levels of complexity in, again, a conflict situation, but this time in Bosnia. And in this context, they looked at students with different levels of needs, those who were more affected by the disaster, those who had mental health needs that were clear and in need of additional specialised support. And they kept track of these students. In some schools, they were able to provide not only a tier 1 intervention like a universal program for all students, but they were actually also able to provide the additional support for kids with heightened needs and even referral to specialists. But in other schools, there was no capacity to provide tier 2 or tier 3 interventions. Overall, what was found was that even the kids who should have had tier 2 and tier 3 interventions but didn't, improved in their mental wellbeing just from being in the social emotional learning program with their peers. So what we could see from that is this is a safe kind of approach for all students, even those with heightened needs. And that's very encouraging, particularly in circumstances where we can't afford to get specialised support to every kid, much as we would like to when the need is indicated. So with all that evidence in mind, like social emotional learning programs work, we might have a question, well, what is a social emotional learning program? Well, just quite basically, it's where we explicitly teach in the classroom things like how to help understand your emotions, how to imagine what things might be like for others, looking at techniques for managing our emotions, for expressing our social needs, for navigating our friendships, for solving problems, for providing peer support, for help seeking when we need to, and for having good management strategies to help us get through the everyday challenges that we encounter. When we provide a program like that, we could be really reassured that even though we're taking up valuable classroom instruction time, the evidence base from social emotional learning programs in general, not particularly in disaster situations, is that they have a very pronounced positive and robust series of effects. Mental effects, positive mental well-being, increase in learning attainment with kids able to concentrate and learn more effectively, longer term results with better employability, reduce risk-taking behaviour around sex and alcohol and drugs, and of course, what we just mentioned, reduced prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder following disaster. So what we can see from this evidence base is this is clearly worth investing school time in. The question might be more, why don't we have them already always there, rather than should we make time for them now? The other thing we can see, which I think is a really important positive side benefit of social emotional learning programs, is when schools do provide them, we see an effect on the quality of the teacher-student relationship, which of course a positive teacher-student relationship in itself is a key protective factor for children, as are positive peer relationships. So if we're going to have improved peer relationships and improved teacher-student relationships, that on its own would be a reason to invest in these programs. Also, because as we know from broader research in education, that when we have positive teacher-student relationships, kids actually learn better. They behave better, they concentrate more effectively, and they feel happier about being in the class. So again, something absolutely worth investing in. However, we need to understand, I think with a lot more compassion than is currently typically expressed, what happens to teachers during these times? What's it like for them when they're dealing with children who are expressing a lot more challenges with concentration and cooperation than normally would be expected? And when we look at the research that's been conducted into teacher wellbeing in the context of emergencies, we see that typically through their valour, compassion and commitment, teachers tend to do reasonably well during the heightened part of the emergency, but burnout rates are quite high afterwards. So not only are teachers frontline workers, but and they give that kind of work as any emergency worker would, but they are doing so with a level of trepidation, because at the same time as they are asked to do more with less, they're also often asked to do different things, like to do some things they haven't done before. So if teachers haven't been supported and trained and become experienced in providing forms of social emotional learning, what we can find is that they're actually really nervous about providing the intervention itself, because they have concerns like, maybe I won't be good at it, will it cause upset, is this good for kids, what do I need to know to manage this? So in order to support a kind of a robust approach to provision, we need to be mindful also of teacher wellbeing and what are we going to do to support their capacity to themselves stay well and also to stay professionally confident about what they're doing. Now, I want to turn now to some things that we do have in place, because nobody starts from nowhere. So we're not having to reinvent a brand new wheel to provide to schools when we're asking them to provide social emotional learning. Particularly in the Victorian context, we have a really robust program and it's available open access, free actually for anyone in the world to access, and it's available for every level from foundation to final years of schooling. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that program now, because I've had the opportunity not only as key author to provide the program, but also to research it in 20 primary schools and 18 secondary schools in a partnership grant provided by the Australian Research Council. So a little bit about this program. What's inside it? Well, what's inside every level of the program is this same topic structure where we cover off on a number of different areas, ranging from emotional literacy through to problem solving and coping strategies. And we culminate with a focus on positive gender relations which includes a focus on prevention of gender-based violence. And this is really quite important because, as we know from remembering back to the first points about what are the problems that increase during times of emergency, gender-based violence is one, mental health distress is the other. So what is the program overall sort of up to? Well, it's making a big focus on helping kids to have a language and some constructs through which to not only understand themselves, but also to become aware more about how what they do affects other people. And there's a kind of a human rights orientation underpinning this. So the notion that, it's part of our shared responsibility, not only to seek our own rights to be fulfilled, but also to fulfill the rights of others. A little bit of a sampling now. I want to give you a little bit of a flavour of what might be going on in different classrooms when children are engaged in a program like this. So for a start, in the topic around emotional literacy, kids are learning a language through which to talk about emotions. And not only to talk about emotions, but to distinguish between emotions that are reasonably easy to manage and those that are quite escalated. And once, you've become devastated rather than hurt, or you're terrified rather than simply afraid, you need different coping strategies. And you sometimes need other people to be available to help you to manage yourself. We also talk about complexity in emotions. So this iceberg image there is one of the tools that we use to help children understand that the emotion that presents on the surface may not be the whole story. There could be a whole lot of other stuff going on underneath, which they need to learn to understand for themselves and learn to think about in terms of other people. While they're doing this work, though, it's the method as well as the content that's important. So all throughout the program, we use what are called collaborative learning activities, which simply means kids do peer-to-peer work, not just individual work, and not just work to and from them and their teacher. And it is that social endeavour of doing this work together that builds the capacity, the familiarity, and the confidence that children need to talk about things like how they feel with each other. And it also gives them practice in working in mixed friendship groups, so learning that they can work with anyone else in the class, and also in mixed gender groups. I'm going to share with you, rather than just sharing data though, a couple of little kids' voices around what kids have had to say about doing activities within this program. So just a little bit from a couple of young men from Hume Central. Within this program, though, we're not only working on emotions, we're also trying to develop a language and some concepts to help kids talk about what we value in human beings and what we might value in ourselves, or things that we might call our strengths. So again, this is setting up a lot of language. So we need to be able to help kids catch themselves and appreciate what it might take sometimes to be patient and sometimes to be sensitive, or sometimes to be supportive and sometimes to be logical. These are all different attributes, all different strengths we call on. So part of the program is helping kids to develop a language for appraising the kind of things we value in ourselves and in each other. We have an explicit focus also on what are we going to do with our escalated emotions? How are we going to cope under challenge? And so they would collectively work on things like sharing their coping strategies, looking for a diverse portfolio to be built up, and helping to see how they could also speak to each other about what it is that we do to cope. So I'll give you a little bit of a sample here of kids engaging with this learning activity you see in front of you, where they're putting together a robust coping portfolio for themselves so that they can become aware that when we face different challenges, we might need to use a different combination of coping strategies. I think you can see when you watch like a little micro collaborative learning activity like this paired sharing one, that these children are not only learning how to think about and talk about coping, they're also getting practice in relationship skills and how to talk to each other about coping. And in this case, kids reporting that when their teachers put them into mixed gender pairs and mixed gender groups, that actually also helps with building more positive gender relations in the classroom. But more than coping strategies, kids are also reporting that they need particular skills and help with skills to de-escalate their heightened levels of stress. And I think there's something we can learn here from what the children talk about and how they're positively appraising the opportunity to learn what we would call, mindfulness or stress management skills and techniques. I think as you can hear those children talking there, that the links they make between being available for learning and getting their mind into the situation where they're not so distracted by either their emotions, their worries, or their social interactions is a really great reminder to us about the value of spending this kind of time with kids in class. But we also provide kids with a lot of techniques for what we would call problem solving. And the reason why is we also interview kids and they tell us things like, now that mindfulness is really great, it helps us to calm down, but we want to do more than calm down. We want to be able to solve our problems, not just calm down about them. So kids are reporting it really important that they get a chance to work with others in the class around little scenarios and engage in problem solving activities where they think through things like what would be the multiple causes of a problem? What might be holding a problem in place in my life or somebody's life? What are some of the possible strategies and possible consequences? So in other words, we give them tools to guide them to slow down and do the thinking work, often with the assistance of others, so we can think through what we do with the problem that presents before we charge into action. And kids particularly like this sense that there's a structure that can help them to have those kind of conversations. We do also work on the communication skills, like what is it going to take to carry through your problem solving skills in a manner that's respectful for others, and the chance to role play and rehearse and develop a language for these techniques of communication are also really appreciated by children. While we're doing that, we also laying down a lot of language that kids need to acknowledge and name what we would call positive social interactions. It's a really great thing to be able to motivate or notice or nurture or endorse or energize or enjoy a friend. And it's a whole different thing if you jeer, sneer, tease, scoff, sneer, snarl, or yell at people. So we need a language for understanding positive and negative behaviour. And when we do have that language, we are much better equipped to talk about how to show respect in cross-gender relations. So by the time the kids get to doing work on understanding what is gender, where does it come from, what is shaping us to be gendered human beings, and how we're born into very gendered societies with certain effects, they have also a language for the positive, like how do we show respect and how do we work on creating more positive gender norms. So overall, the project does culminate by helping kids to get into the pointy end around just talking about family violence and other forms of violence that can happen against them from the very beginning of early years of school, where we focus on teaching the skills for bodily autonomy and their rights to safety over their own bodies, right through to more complex relationship-based activities where we look at scenarios with kids at the top end of primary school and into secondary school that are, different forms of complex interactions are happening that can be very sexualized in nature, where forms of gender-based violence are transacted between peers, and what is it that we need to be able to do to handle or get help to handle these situations. So that kind of gives you a flavour of the sort of things we're doing to build positive capacity for peer support and for help seeking. We're using collaborative learning strategies so kids are having a chance to work with each other and practice the skills in class that they need to use in their social relationships out of class. We're really strongly advocating intentionality and normalising that help seeking is an important activity to use in life when things get tough. We need to work out the difference between small problems we can handle on our own and more serious ones that we need to involve others in helping us with. And then what will we say is the take-home message from this? Overall, in times of distress and additional duress, it is really relationships that matter. And if we're helping with relationship skills, we are getting our job done. So let me finish my presentation just with a couple of other messages from some children. What do they say teachers should be aware of and doing in terms of looking after the kids? Well, thank you. So I'll leave the presentation there, and I hope that you've got some endorsement from the children around why these sorts of learning are important to them, and also some awareness of the fact that we do have an evidence base around what works, and certainly we have an indicated need in our prevalence data. So let's throw it open to any questions or comments or other things that people might want to add, and hand over to you, Bridget.
That's really fantastic tour of a big body of work, and then some really lovely detail, as you say, with those kids' voices in there, just to really polish it. Helen, I really appreciated that session. We have time for Q&A now, and we've probably got just over 10 minutes of scheduled time. And it's been a terrific turnout today, including some people might have had an extra challenge in getting on. So I'm just wanting to encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A, which a couple of people have already. I suppose just as a kick-off, and then I'll come to those questions, I thought I might ask you, Helen, you said early on, and we saw it in your very high quality example, what constitutes a sort of sustained or a high quality program. What's an example of something that's not sustained, or that you'd be concerned about, that kind of doesn't tick enough boxes to be useful? Just to give us a feel for that.
Well, let me just say, doesn't tick enough boxes to be useful enough. So oftentimes we think of an emergency as we need to do a rapid response in the immediate aftermath, which we do, but that on its own is not enough. So all that sort of intensive, let's do settling in work in the first 2 weeks back at school and help kids understand what happened, that's great. But if we don't provide a sustained educative process, then the fact that they are continuing to experiencing challenges over time, that the impact of the disaster has a long tail which they're living through. And anyway, even if there wasn't a disaster, life is presenting challenges anyway. If we don't provide that sustained learning over time, and we do a kind of one-off thing, it's a little bit like putting a Band-Aid on, but someone's got a chronic infection. It's not enough. So the problem is, in my view, is when we don't provide a structural home, like inside the timetable across the school year, for something that's really important.
Well, that's been great. Thank you for just tightening up that definition. And I noticed you highlighted the peer-to-peer component of that interactive element, I'm imagining, is also pretty
It's
critical.
very important. And in fact, when the research is done around the world in using these programs, that's actually the thing that's most usually not provided. So teachers tend to default to more traditional approaches: write in your workbook, do this on your own, put your hand up, do some answers. That actually doesn't give the opportunity for the peer-to-peer social skill development and social confidence. It's a bit like, teaching soccer and having kids watch a video of wonderful players. It's great, but it's not enough. You've got to get out and kick the ball as well. And so in terms of the social interactions, kids are saying to us, the stuff we interact with each other in the playground is not enough, because we might either normally talk about sport, play sport, or do gossip. So when you make us have these more important conversations in class on stuff that really matters, that's really helpful, because it gives us a chance to have a go at that. And then we become better at doing it for ourselves.
Yeah, thanks. That's fantastic. Just picking up on the first question that was flagged by Amanda. Amanda's asking, are there specific SEL programs and research conducted for children in the special ed environment who've got disabilities here in Australia? I work in this area, and it feels like we're constantly trying to adapt ideas that are really constructed for the mainstream.
I think that's very true, the need to be constantly adapting. And while we've had programs, specialised programs in sexuality education and protective behaviours education for special settings, we haven't necessarily had the SEL programs. Certainly we had pilot schools in our study who were special schools, and what they were chiefly doing is that grand act of bringing their own skill to modify a program. And what they typically did was use the learning structures, say from foundation level 1 and 2, but brought across the scenarios from the higher levels or age appropriate levels of the program, and then they had to modify their own. So I do think there's an indicated need for more work in that area, but also I wanted to acknowledge the incredible skill of those teachers as they did that work, that hybrid work.
Just sort of following on from that, I had a thought myself. The other side of the coin, you were mentioning about supporting teachers as feeling not always ready for this, but I was thinking as a mental health professional, that how the work serves as secondary prevention. You mentioned that it's really useful for kids who are already tagged as having particular needs. Do you think there's value, or is it some part of your program to promote or publish this work in more into the specialist clinical or research settings? Because sometimes I feel frustrated that some really high quality primary level work isn't as highly valued as it could be for its mental health benefit. Do you want to?
Oh, look, I think there's many reasons why that doesn't end up happening. And one of them is that the world still prefers a kind of tradition in research, which is the randomized controlled trial study, which is extremely hard to set up in schools because it's actually hard to control and provide a consistent intervention. So we don't get the same kinds of findings that go into the literature that other health professionals might read. But I think what we could raise awareness of, I think better, is that many health professionals are also doing educative work. They're helping people to learn how to cope, learn how to talk about things, learn how to understand and manage their emotions, and learn to manage their social lives. And that teachers are great at setting up those educative processes because they're education experts. They're experts on learning, and not all learning needs to be pathologized. So, and the other thing is, of course, if a kid is troubled or lonely or struggling, if you can produce a happier, more socially supportive class environment around them through strong, healthy peer relationships, they're just going to be traveling through life in a much safer place anyway. And even that in itself is a great effect of the social emotional learning programs, because they lead to reduced bullying, reduced homophobia, reduced exclusion of children with disabilities. So yeah, building the social health of the class is actually a really important part of the endeavour.
I hear that completely. There's a couple of questions that are highly geared to something specific, but then there's one that's incredibly broad, and I guess around the issue of gender. So I just wondered, you didn't feature a lot in your conversation about the particular focus on gender, but someone's flagged, is it important to be thinking of children as children instead of boys and girls and educating them that way? Do you want to make a comment on gender emphasis?
I would say it's both and. Children are very, very aware of gender norms, and in fact, they're very operative in controlling their social interactions and who they think they can be friends with. We're finding that children are reporting to us that it's quite negative for them that they're chiefly gender segregated at school, not because their teachers segregate them, but because that is the way things happen. And what they're most appreciating, therefore, is teachers making an effort to bring them into cross-gender interactions. And kids, for example, reporting that, it's quite common still in schools for male-female friendships to be sexualized, for them to be teased by peers and by adults and by teachers if they're showing friendship with opposite sex or anything. So we have to be aware of both that they are children, but also that these gender norms are influencing social interactions in many, many ways. So having an explicit focus on gender as well with kids is a way for them to start to talk about where those gender norms are operating in their lives in ways that are limiting and also sometimes in ways that are harmful, and what we can do to open up our thinking so that we can sidestep those constraints a little bit more effectively than we might otherwise.
Just to get to that very specific questions that one was about the quadruple R program, and one was about the FUSE opportunities being available for Department of Education teachers. I guess these two people are asking, is FUSE only open to teachers in public schools, or is it available for Catholic schools? And then someone's asked about the quadruple R being available and adapted beyond the Victorian or the Australian setting.
It's a completely open access program. Anyone in the school, anyone in the world can access it, download it free. In terms of it being available, therefore, in other countries, yes, other people in other countries can use it. In terms of gender-based violence prevention education programs for a more developing country context, we've also authored one of those, which is provided through UNESCO, and it's rolling out in a number of countries in Asia and Africa right now. It uses a similar approaches, and certainly we've got data that shows that it's having positive effects. So there are a number of programs, but there is only one other open access program I've been able to find in the world, which is all the way from foundation through to year 11 and 12, social emotional learning, but it's provided by the World Bank, and it's also for every level, and it's open access. So if you look for the World Bank Social Emotional Learning Program, you would find another free open access one.
We've got a little flurry now of questions. I'll pick up at least one or two more. And if we do go slightly over the 45, does that work okay for you, Helen?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think because it's a 45-minute seminar, people might have a bit of flexibility. So we'll keep going. Somebody's asked, you mentioned the importance of the role of teacher stress. Wondering about your thoughts on the role of teachers developing their own social emotional awareness skills before they work in a demanding classroom or in the process of their professional lives.
Well, it's both and, because as a teacher, you never stop developing your social emotional skills, because it's one long act of emotional labour as well as pedagogical labour. But what we find, certainly, and we find this in the research, is that when teachers are teaching these techniques to kids, they're also teaching them to themselves. And when we provide professional learning in this area, often the response from teachers is, oh, straight away using that at home. Oh, and I'll teach it to my class as well. So there's a kind of a usefulness that's quite generic in the skills and in the techniques that we're teaching the kids. And look, I think the data that says that teachers become more democratic, more student-centred and closer to their students when they provide these programs is also an indicator that the programs are good for teachers as well. I would distinguish just a little bit though about how our research also shows that it's a lot more challenging for teachers when they get onto more sensitive topics at the point, what I call the pointy end. By the time we're asking teachers to teach about gender-based violence, they're a lot more anxious because there's a far more challenges in our society right now in terms of how we understand or even speak openly about things like gender-based violence. And so the anxiety levels from teachers are much higher in relation to that, rather than, say, as compared to just talking about stress and coping and social skills and these sort of less controversial areas. So we should bear that the more we ask people to go where the distress is highest in terms of prevention education, the more they actually need professional support and training.
I can see a few questions have emerged around cultural adaptations, language and cultural groups, but also there's an interesting question here about resistance, and I thought maybe others would be interested. Have you found much opposition or resistance from community gatekeepers with regard to this program? And if so, what's your advice for addressing that?
Well,
that's a clear question to you.
Yeah.
You understand what they're talking about?
Yeah, look, there's not resistance around teaching what I would call the social emotional skills, but there is community resistance, organised, targeted resistance around teaching around gender equality and prevention of gender-based violence. But in the time that this program I'm dealing with now, since we first had the Resilience, Rights and Respectful Relationships program, it's swung from organised community opposition and front page on the Herald Sun complaining about a grade 3-4 activity where you look at gender norms in fairy tales, like this is a big problem, through to now we've got parents demanding, where are you doing the consent education? So if you like, schools are being pressed by both sides, by the community. You need to do this. We need you to do this well. And on the other side, why? How dare you do this? We don't want you to do this. So that puts school leaders in a very tricky position. It's certainly an era where politics intrudes into the school world more than it would do so, say, for example, in terms of science education or maths education right now in our society.
We probably need to round up. I'm just thinking it might be possible, it will be possible to save the questions, so we might be able to find a bit of a chance for a typed response at some point, but also maybe as a last one, because it is generally so relevant to your program. Someone said, Alice has said that they're curious about the program rolling out in secondary compared to primary settings and the very different challenges for teachers. Do you find that?
Absolutely. The secondary school, and it's just shown all around the world in social emotional learning research, the structural barriers in the secondary school almost preclude provision. So what we have is a major assessment tail wagging the secondary school dog such that typically in year 11 and 12 there is nothing provided because it's all just your senior subjects. Then further down the school, we try to squash it all into a tiny little subject called health PE, where they're struggling to get even enough time to cover all the other stuff they need to do with sex ed and drug ed and other forms of health education. So yeah, we have major structural barriers. I think it's time for a curriculum reform and some structural rethinking about what we spend our time doing in secondary schools and what we don't let in the gate because it doesn't fit in the timetable.
Yeah. Well, look, I think that's been an amazingly vibrant and exciting presentation. I certainly feel that way myself, Helen. I feel really grateful to you for that, and also for everyone coming and asking those rather good and pointed questions. I think I want to just mention that the link to the Quadruple R site is in the chat for people who were wanting to follow that up straight away. I Googled it myself. It's pretty easy to find. So those publicly available resources, that's a tremendous resource for us to know about if we didn't already. I imagine there's quite a mix in the room. Quite a few people have had to leave, but many have stayed right until the end. So this has been really compelling, I think, for the people who've been able to attend today, Helen, and we are very grateful to you. I'd like to just let the audience know that this is the last of our series for this year, or for this time being, but we will return later in the year with some more Melbourne Social Equity Institute mental health and society program seminars. Please do subscribe to the Melbourne Social Equity Institute email list if you'd like updates about the seminars that are coming up. And I think that's, with no further ado, I'll close out the session with congratulations to our outstanding presenter. Thank you so much, Helen. That's been wonderful.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for attending.